So thank you all for being here. It's our pleasure at Morgan Lewis to be partnering with Ivy Family Office Network. My name is Tomer Inbar. I am a partner in New York in the tax-exempt organizations group. So a little different than what you've been hearing for yesterday and for the rest of today. But Casey, who is my colleague, we work together very closely. And I focus on nonprofit tax-exempt organizations. But I'm also one of the co-leads of our family office strategic initiative and that practice. And one of the things that we focus on is thinking about holistically the needs of family offices. And more family offices are the locus for how families do their philanthropy, their philanthropic interventions, and thinking about philanthropic capital. Both, and we'll talk a bit about how they deploy philanthropic capital in the investment space. Casey and I spend a lot of our time in the zone between the for-profit and the nonprofit world. So we do a lot of work on impact investing, fund formation, and other things with our other colleagues at Morgan Lewis. We have a very large practice in this area focusing on impact. And when we think about that in the context of family offices, thinking about how different family members and how different families think about their role in the world and the impact they want to leave. And so that's something that's been very interesting for us as we've gotten more involved with family offices, which often become the locus for how families do this work. We're offering CLE credit for this. If you have any questions, please contact Aisha Khan or Hillary Smith. And separately, if you have questions, feel free to ask them. I'll repeat them. I've been warned. And so we will go ahead and get started because I know we have a day that's pretty full. So as I started, and I think I'll get a clicker in a second, but as I started, family offices have become really important in the context of philanthropy and thinking about how we deploy family assets. No, thinking about how we deploy family assets on behalf of philanthropic endeavors and how we think about the philanthropic activities of families. So more and more as we move away from simple grant making, for example, where we have lived for a long time, families and family offices have been, and philanthropies have been thinking about impact and impact investing and thinking about how to use philanthropic dollars in the impact space using market mechanisms to achieve charitable, social impact, environmental goals. And it's been a fascinating ride because over the last 20, I've been doing this for almost 30 years. And in the last 20 years, we've really seen a beginning of an explosion, 15 years, a bigger explosion. And since we've been doing this over the last 5 to 7 years together, we've really been seeing this heightened interest from different generations within family offices to use impact investing and investing to achieve both social good as well as financial returns. And so when we think about this, when we think about impact investing, and then in the family office context, family offices and the family office members are often left to maintain boundaries, to think about how we use philanthropic dollars, whether in the form of a private foundation or a donor-advised fund, and thinking about how to use them in the context of everything else that is going on within the family office. And so we're going to talk a little bit about investing and co-investing with philanthropic funds, and how do we think about deploying capital in this way alongside the other capital that's being deployed and the other interests that the families have. And so just a couple of level setting things that we'll do when we think about impact and impact investing. From a continuum, which we'll go into in a second, the impact investing can advance charitable purposes, which is things like education, science, research. We talked about Stand Up to Cancer. We think about how we deploy capital to achieve a social good, but it can also have a mission-related threshold, which is not as kind of narrow as charitable, but is aligned with mission, with family values, with goals within society. And we think about that as a broader impact, and charitable is a subset of impact. And that's something that we'll talk about a little bit, not a ton. And an impact investment can offer a market rate of return. It can be just as profitable as other investments, or it could be concessionary. So it could be designed in a way to crowd in other funding to achieve a charitable return as the primary goal, as opposed to a financial return, or we can have both a charitable return and a financial return side by side, depending on how we structure it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Is there any way to advance the slides? Thank you. So next one, please. Great. So just as a quick start, we come at it starting from the private foundation. So within a family office, there's often a foundation, there's also a donor advised fund often. So when we think about philanthropic capital, we think about how to deploy that first. Separately, family members can also be impact investors in their own right, in which case they don't have these rules in the same way, but as we'll end, we'll talk about how a family member who is impact oriented might be investing side by side with philanthropic capital. Often we bundle capital within the family office when there is a foundation or donor advised fund to think about how to maximize impact and returns. So if I start on the far, on my right, which I don't know which way you're looking at it, but grants are the easiest things that philanthropies and foundations and DAFs have done. And those people sometimes call them investments because they're investing in their grantees. But when we move away from deploying capital as grants into thinking about them in an investment way, we have what we call program-related investments, which we'll talk about in a minute, which are often concessionary or subsidized investments with the goal of bringing in more capital into things that are impactful to the world. Example is that we might de-risk a fund or an investment for regular market investors because we need the market money. And so the philanthropic capital ends up being a buffer and it entices in market investment because something that might be too risky without that buffer, without that loss layer, becomes less risky and the impact then gets heightened. Then we move over to program related but commercially viable so that they're not as risky as it might be on subsidized investments, but they're still not necessarily prudent from a state law standpoint or from an investment standpoint. Once we cross over the prudence line, which is in the middle, we get to a mission-aligned or mission-related investment that has a strong alignment to the charitable purposes or the social impact values of the family, but it is a prudent investment. It would fit into a prudent portfolio, and it's thought of that way, so it has less restrictions and rules around it when we think about doing them. And lastly, we have mission-related that more is like a negative filter. We're not going to invest in tobacco, firearms, or things like that. And we'll do that in a way that's still a mission-aligned investment, but it's not necessarily one that is as active or direct as some of the other kinds of mission investments.
Can I just tell you that the mission-related investment is a huge topic in our group. So anything
yes.
You can add
yeah.
any color.
Absolutely.
Sure, we're going to get into that right now. Thank you, Marnie.
So I'll jump in to just kind of start defining a little bit the program-related investment, which was that right side of the continuum, and then mission-related, which Marty just mentioned is, a big topic of conversation for this group. Starting with program-related investments, this is actually a defined term under the Internal Revenue Code. And so these are investments by private foundations that are really made for charitable purposes. So the general rule of thumb for private foundations is that under 4944 is that you can't make jeopardizing investments that would somehow interfere or impose on the way that the foundation is able to accomplish its charitable activities. This is essentially the prudent investor standard under federal law. Program-related investments are an exception to that overall prudence rule. And what the code does is actually treat program-related investments like grants. So thinking back to that continuum, we're on the side of the scale of grant making, but now in the form of an investment. So we're moving a little bit toward the middle, but we're still on the grant side of the spectrum. So as investments that are treated like grants, PRIs are actually, they do count towards a foundation's 5% payout. So there's that benefit, but they have a very specific definition. So there's a kind of three-pronged definition for what these types of investments have to comply with. One is that their primary purpose has to be a charitable purpose. The second prong is that no purpose can be, or no significant purpose rather, can be the appreciation of income. So this is, as Tomer mentioned, we're on the concessionary, we put our concessionary hat on when we're analyzing the financial outcomes of this, potential financial outcomes of the investment. And then the third is that it can't have any political or lobbying legislative purpose. So, in sum, it looks like a pretty easy definition, maybe deceptively simple. We spend a lot of our time kind of hammering out with our clients, what is the charitable purpose? We're making an investment in a company, in an investment fund, perhaps a loan. What is the purpose in order to achieve to move the needle on the charitable issue that we're looking to solve. So that's where we spend a lot of our time. And also weighing that financial, that second prong of what is the purpose? It may, produce income. Is that necessarily a bad thing? It can't be the reason we're going in, but it doesn't mean we can't do well through this investment.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's an intention. It's not an actual what happens. And so what we often get the question about is, well, my intention was to come in as concessionary capital, or my intention was to fund this research. I didn't know it would be such a big hit, and we were able to commercialize it down the line. And is that a problem? It's absolutely not. So if you have a PRI that you went into in the beginning and you did the analysis and you felt that it was appropriate, and then down the line it actually worked out well, that's okay. We don't look with hindsight at it. What we look at is the time you made it. And so it's very interesting when you see the interplay, as Casey about to take us through to the next set of rules, that for a PRI, it's about what we intend as opposed to what actually happens down the road.
So once we've, determined that what we want to do is a PRI and we meet this statutory definition, then we're negotiating with the investor or with the investee, and we have another set of rules, and this comes up under 4945 of the code. And it requires for program-related investments that charitable investors exercise what's called expenditure responsibility. And this is just a very technical, regulatory compliance focused section that requires very kind of specific compliance. So there has to be an agreement that codifies the charitable purpose, the use of the funds for those charitable purposes, certain reporting requirements, whether it's financial, also potentially programmatic, record-keeping requirements with access by the foundation. And then the sort of most controversial provision and most contentious when negotiated is this concept of a buyback provision, where if the funds are not used for charitable purposes, they do have to be returned to the foundation. And as you can imagine, this does not sit super well with companies and funds when they're not familiar with these rules, but it is sort of it's a fact of program-related investments and something that we spend a lot of time working on.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about, as you're negotiating any investment, when you might have a side letter where there are things on the business side that you want, when you're going into a fund or if you're investing directly, when we invest on the PRI side, we also have to articulate, as Casey said, the charitable purposes, but also these various things. And the buyback is the single most thing that we negotiate all the time, because fund people, companies understand it better, but funds don't understand it very well. They don't like it. They don't like giving the right for one investor to get out in the event something has happened specific to that investor. It's a very narrow situation. I think in my 30 years of doing this, I've seen it exercised once or twice, but at the heart of it, it scares fund folks and it scares fund formation lawyers. So the investment management lawyers on the other side often get very nervous about this, and we spend a lot of time on it. But again, it's a key to doing this because it's required and it allows you to treat it as part of your 5% payout for the foundation.
So now we're moving along the continuum. We've kind of jumped over that divide and we're on the left-hand side. And we are talking about mission-related investments. And interestingly, MRIs are not defined under state or federal law. So generally speaking, MRIs are market investments with some level of impact, and that could be to a greater or lesser degree. And as Tomer mentioned, it could be more or less charitable. It could be impactful or, a negative filter where we're not having a direct impact, but we're steering our money towards certain uses. And there's this alignment with the mission to a greater or lesser degree, and also financial prudence. So we are going through the analysis of, under federal law, the 4944 prudent investor standard that I mentioned, it has to, it can't breach the jeopardizing investment rules. And then also under state law, it has to meet the prudent investor standards. So this comes up under MIFA, which is the Uniform Management of Institutional Funds Act. And that governs investment decisions and endowment expenditures, and it's applicable in about 49 states. And so we're really balancing those prudent factors along with the mission-related purpose that we are intending to make with this investment.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you're investing foundation dollars, you're stuck with prudence. Stuck is the wrong way to say it, but prudence is part of it. Unlike when a family member or family assets want to just do riskier investments because they like the environment or they believe that they have an orphan disease that they want to help fund the research for. They have more flexibility. But when the foundation does it, they need to have this prudent standard. And so it's something that we have to think about as we'll get into co-investing in a second. But as we think about what prudence means in the context of the foundation's portfolio, who's managing that portfolio, how do we think of the investment policy for the foundation? And now more and more donor advised funds have the same issue. So we worry about prudence in a certain way. And luckily the IRS, after many years of being very cagey about this, harmonized the federal and the state prudence standard. There's no real federal prudence standard, right? That was kind of an overlay for private foundations. And for many years, the IRS was saying, well, it could be different than with state law and so on and so forth, which made it impossible for investment committees and families and family offices that were managing foundation dollars to know where their prudence lines were going to be. And so it was very important to harmonize those things. But then when we move back to what Casey was talking about, this notion of mission-related investments, once we've determined its prudence, then the question of impact and how much mission-relatedness and how you think about impact is really up to you. Right? It could be deep impact, or it could be weaker impact. But the goal is to think about it in the context of what does impact mean? And there are families more and more that are saying that they want to be 100% in for impact, where they want their entire portfolio within the family and family office to be starting with the foundation over to the personal assets to somehow touch impact. And we're seeing that as a trend more and more. Marty, you look like you have a question.
Is the prudence standard one that each state sets themselves, or is it a matter that you can set a process?
Got it.
Protocol for?
Yeah, so the question was whether the prudence standard varies by state, or can you set a protocol? And the answer is that under MIFA, which is the statute that Casey had mentioned, it sets a general standard, but it's left to investment committees, fiduciaries to determine what is prudent and what makes sense based on the factors articulated in MIFA, the market conditions, the need for funding, the things that are, there's about, I think, 8 or 9 factors that are financial. And then one factor, which is great, which says you can, in thinking about prudence, you can take into consideration the relationship of an asset to the charitable purposes of the foundation. So this is where mission investment comes in. It allows you to think about prudence in a broader way, where if you have an investment that would print money, for example, and had no mission, and that would get you a return of X, you're allowed to think of an investment that would get you a return of X minus 1 if it is a mission investment, because you have another factor to consider. Namely, this is aligned with the mission of the foundation. So that non-economic factor goes side by side now with all the economic factors of the conditions of the market and the returns and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting thing because, Marty, to your question, it does allow fiduciaries and boards and investment committees to make decisions about prudence covered by the business judgment rule, thinking about their fiduciary duties to do this in a way that allows different families to have different levels of prudence. And we see this all the time with different foundations. Some foundations have more risk tolerance than others, and some foundations look at it in a different way. But again, it gets back to the fiduciary judgment and the prudence articulation that a committee, a board might do. And the last piece of that question is, MIFA is in effect in 49 states?
I think it's about 49, yeah.
Pennsylvania has its own unique version, and hasn't adopted MIFA, but it has a version of the older statute. But most states have a consistent statute with consistent approaches, but that doesn't mean that the standard is the same in every state, because the standard is up to the board, the fiduciaries to articulate.
And I would just take a minute to contrast PRIs and MRIs and just mention, so MRIs don't have the constraints we were talking about in terms of those side letter provisions that are a must-have, reporting, the buyback, et cetera. But they do come with other consideration. So for foundation funds, the excess business holding rules, which applies to, it limits the amount of combined holdings that a foundation and a family member can have, or an entity controlled by family members can have in the same investment. So we do have some set of rules that that do apply when we're thinking about mission-related investments. Moving on to co-investing. So this is, when the question comes up, can a family member invest their personal capital alongside their charitable capital in the same deal? And I mean, I think the headline here is sort of a lawyerly answer. It is permissible, but we have to manage pretty significant compliance considerations and do it in a way that takes into consideration the facts and circumstances and manages compliance moments that we might have.
Yeah, we have two specific, you probably heard self-dealing. It sounds horrible, right? Like, oh my God, I'm going to self-deal right now. But it's a series of rules that were put in place in the late 60s to get at some abuses within foundations that were perceived but not actually real. But it really restricts a lot of transactions that involve insiders, board members, family members of board members, what we call disqualified persons, and foundations, as well as what Casey mentioned. There's a whole set of rules on how much of a business enterprise a foundation plus their disqualified persons can own. So we know because of the excess business holding rules, we can co-invest, because you can't have a rule that says together we can own X if we can't invest together. So we know we can do that. But at the same time, to Casey's point, we want to watch the boundaries of, are we entering into impermissible transactions? Can we go to the next slide, please? And as we do that, we think about, okay, so I'm getting mixed messages from the tax code and from my regulator. I can do it, but I have to do it in a certain way and carefully. But you're not going to give me a lot of information about how I can do it, because that would be helpful. And if we don't have that information, then we have to make it up. But at the heart of it, what we think about is that if the self-dealing rules are about we can't benefit insiders in a certain way, then when we make an investment or a co-investment, we want to ask about benefit flow. We want to ask about, am I doing something with the foundation dollars that's going to benefit the insider, the family member, in a way that is not normal, not market, et cetera? So for example, one of the things we think about is fees or thresholds to get into an investment. If there's a $5 million minimum and the foundation puts in 4.5 million, and the only way the family member gets in is because the foundation put in 4.5 million, that could be an impermissible benefit. If that family member would not be entitled to the reduced fees at 5 million, at 500,000, but because of the foundation, they give them the reduced fees, then that could also be a perceived benefit. There's no hard and fast rules, but what we do is we look at the circumstances around the investment and ask ourselves, is this kind of the way it should be? Is everybody kind of going in the right way for what they're doing? Are we sort of benefiting everybody? We're benefiting the foundation by having the family in. We're kind of getting reduced fees all around and so on and so forth. And we just ask about benefit flow. And there are different times when you ask the questions about co-investing, when the foundation goes in first and then de-risks an investment, and then the family member comes in a little later, that the foundation has really taken that investment to a place that would be de-risked and investable. The opposite, where the foundation went in, where the family member went in first and the investment's doing poorly, so the foundation comes in to stabilize it, or when they co-invest at the same time. Co-investing at the same time is always the easiest because generally you're on the same terms. But then we look at what the market says. Like at some point, if I invested in a very early round as the foundation, because that was my job to help like bring this nascent investment that's going to find a cure for cancer and help that research get out there. But now there have been 4 rounds of investment and the market has sort of cleansed that, right? The market has made a judgment that this is an investment that's fine now. It's no longer dependent on that investment that the foundation made. Then maybe I'm okay, right? Like that's the analysis we do. So we're going to stop here because I know we're a few minutes behind time. I know I was getting an evil eye. I have 10 more minutes?
Yeah, and by I'm gonna tell you,
Yeah.
it's a great topic. We do want to go into that.
Yeah.
We have 10 minutes left.
Great.
And what we're really interested also is warrants, optionality, and things along those lines. It's like, how does Mike Oetgen do it? Right? I mean, things like that.
Right. Well, I don't know
It's a
how.
great topic.
Yeah.
We'll drill down at some point for an hour.
Yeah, I think we can do.
a smaller group.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're gonna open it up to some questions. The other thing I wanted to think about is, like, in addition to the tax rules that Casey and I were talking about, thinking about conflicts of interest, thinking about perception. Within families and family offices, reputation is really important. And as we think about these things, it's really important to remember process helps us get to the right place. And implementing process, particularly when there's philanthropic dollars at play, is kind of important. So I'm going to stop for a second, open it up, and if not, we'll talk about a couple of other things that we left out in our hurry to get you back on schedule. So, yes.
I didn't hear the whole beginning, I was a little late, but I wanted to ask this question. In terms of the foundation versus the individual family office, et cetera, who does all the due diligence there? Who does the analysis? Who makes the decision that this is an investable option? And does then the family office come in? And that's recommended by you guys, or how does that work?
Great question. So the question is one about process, is who does the diligence, who sources the deals, who makes the determination that this is an appropriate investment for the foundation or for the family office, and then when do lawyers come in, and and how is this whole thing managed? So I would start with what the internal policy and the process is within the family office. Who's making investment decisions? What kind of process do you have? Do you have an investment committee? Do you have a couple of family members? Do you have the family office recommend an investment? Who makes the decision? But then we ask the same thing. The foundation will typically have a board of directors, and the board of the foundation is ultimately responsible for the assets and the activities of the foundation. Again, they could be the same exact people. And then overlay that, where often there will be an investment committee or an investment group that will be thinking about investments for everybody. And what is that formally within the foundation? So typically then back up, then an investment comes in, it will always be the family office that will do the diligence, that will think about investments. Then you get an investment that we say, oh, we were looking at this for this reason, but we now realize that there's a very strong mission component here. This is an orphan disease, for example, like nobody's doing this work. We think it's really important to a family member, and we want to support this. And we realize we can do that with foundation dollars because of the research, the publication, where it is in time. So in the diligence that the family office is doing on the investment, there's the additional mission diligence that you're doing. You're asking that question in addition to the financial diligence. You're asking the mission question. If this will satisfy the rules that Casey was talking about earlier, then we can flip it over and have the foundation do it. And then we look at who has authority to make those decisions within the foundation. What process do you go through? And again, you just want to follow that process, but underneath the hood, it's the family office, it's the people who are looking and diligencing investments that are making decisions about appropriateness. Is this appropriate for a foundation, whether as a PRI or an MRI, right? You can still make that determination. And once you do that, then you just go through the normal process of who gets to sign the documents, right? Who has the authority to sign the documents on behalf of the foundation. And it could be the head of the family office might have authority to do that. They might be an officer of the foundation. So all of that stuff is really important as the process from within which you're going to make these decisions. Right.
So two questions. One is, American Cancer Society has its own venture capital
Yes.
arm, $150 million, et cetera. If you can talk about that structure, that'd be great. And also, how does a well-funded nonprofit that sponsors research, what's the best way for it to participate in intellectual property it may develop, whether it's from a licensing or
Right.
royalty and revenue point of view? Maybe you can get some perspective on that, because it's remarkable that some of these nonprofits spin off so much intellectual
Yes.
property and they don't participate in it.
So we'll give you the very short answer of this, and I'll speak generally because they're a client. And so it's okay. And so the question for us is, when I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that we in our group have done for a long time is thinking about how charities commercialize their intellectual property, and thinking about how charities can capitalize on their name, their reputation, their funding, their funder base, in order to attract money to invest in things that will further the mission. So this is something where charities have sponsored investment funds, where you take charity X that has a very strong brand name, and let's say they're in the research, they're doing, let's say, cancer research, and they decide that we want to invest in companies that are going to really move the needle. We have an investment thesis, we understand what to do. we'll go ahead and put together a fund. Now, there are different ways they can do that, and I'm not a fund formation lawyer. Some of my colleagues sitting there will be able to help you better than I can, but I've been around it long enough to be a little bit dangerous. And the idea is that there are various structures that we can put in place for a charity to do that and to go out and effectively fundraise, right? Like what you're talking about is that is part of mission. So for that cancer organization, what it's doing by seeding companies that will develop technologies or processes that will help cure cancer is mission related through and through. And so the questions we ask is what kind of control or oversight does the charity have? How does it think about its reputation and its brand? All of those things get built into the architecture of the structure, but at the heart of it is a question of how do I raise more money to further mission? And so you can set up a vehicle, for example, like a cancer organization could set up a vehicle that will aggregate capital from individuals, from donors, from philanthropies, from family offices, that will be an investment fund. And that fund will go out and invest in companies, and there's a return, it can come back. Or instead of having a return-based mechanism, the donation is enough. Like for some organizations and some funders, just donating to an organization to allow them to invest is sufficient return, the deduction is enough. So it really depends, and there are a lot of structures that we've used, ranging from setting up a single member LLC under a charity that aggregates the capital, to setting up a full-blown investment fund that's sponsored by and controlled by the charity, to then setting up the charity seating a new manager in an area that they want more managers to be involved in, let's say cancer research, and the charity doesn't control the fund, but the charity is an anchor investor. The charity might be aggregating capital to put into the fund as a limited partner. And the charity also might have some mission lock and mission control around brand, around what kind of investments they do, but they do not control investments and they do not control the investment manager. So I think there's a whole continuum that when we talk, my colleagues, Chris and Christine are here, when we talk about funds and how do we go out into the community with charitable funds, there's a lot of issues that come up, but there are a ton of ways that we do it. And a ton of interesting ways that family offices can engage, because they often can aggregate capital from a couple of different pockets that might be useful as anchor investors, particularly on issues that the family cares about. And that's when we get back to this notion of where Casey and I play, that the idea of impact and the idea of charitability and the idea of what is important to me as an investor, but also as a philanthropist, becomes really important. And my last plug for kind of philanthropy is that we in the United States have this incredible history of philanthropy, which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And the rest of the world is catching up to us. You go back as far as de Tocqueville, when de Tocqueville looks at the United States and sees associations everywhere. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting an association. And for us, that's really important, right? Like for us, it's really important. This way of giving is the way we express ourselves in a lot of ways as Americans. And you see this throughout kind of family offices and families about legacy and about what they want to do. And the impact investing space is this really cool space where we can both engage from a mission standpoint, but also put all the things to your question that we do diligence, we understand investing. We can take that and we can apply that to achieving social good.
So two more questions. So by the way, you've hit many of the hot points for our group, but I want to just ask, do you have a white paper on this that you can share with our group? So we'll distribute it and then push it out.
I think we have to dust it off. We definitely have more in-depth presentations about this. And
You just have a chart.
we definitely have materials.
Look at like a lot of these healthcare
Yeah.
nonprofits as platforms.
We absolutely have
Right?
materials.
And then
Yeah.
so much stuff spins
Yeah.
out of it. It's remarkable.
Yeah, no, it's and I like the idea of doing a deeper session for a group of interested
We'd love to
folks.
have a breakfast
Yeah.
sometime, where we can take 40 or 50 people. We're
Yeah.
gonna talk about that structure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, Sean?
Yeah, Marty, I think just a few comments from yesterday connecting the dots. The question came up as we were talking about PRIs and how, our model of cancer, how we're able to work with these industry partners and pharma partners. In connecting a couple dots with PRI, which is interesting, the question came from family office, I'm not sure if he's in the room, about how do the family offices, they're always presented these opportunities. Slide decks where it says X, Y, and Z doctor of this, says it's the next cure to cancer, X, Y, and Z doctor says this, right? They don't have that background internally to vet these opportunities, right? So I think, Marty, this is the solution: is you find funds with organizations that have this internal expertise
Yes.
set up, and you say, we know a % of our portfolio investment strategy on impact should go there because we know they have the internal experts to make the best decision. I think that was that. That's the question.
Yeah.
Is like,
Yeah.
how do we process through these?
As a
Yeah.
platform, what's the structure?
Right, and it's an internal conversation saying we're moving money here every year because this group is better positioned to evaluate that investment.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because, and this is where we see charities playing a real role for family offices and others on the investing front. So when you have a Stand Up for Cancer, for example, that has expertise in the science and the advisory boards and the kind of connections within the community, saying, here are the things, and I'm not plugging anybody, by the way, if my securities lawyers will get me in trouble, but the idea is that you have an organization that's a respected name, and that organization should be doing it right on their end with appropriate counsel and advisors and financial advisors. They do the diligence. They're going to come to you with a package that says, here's our investment thesis. Here's how we approach it. You now have to diligence something you know versus a random deck that's coming across your desk and says, oh, Dr. X thinks this and so on and so forth. Someone else is able to do that diligence at the first cut. And then you, getting back to this question, you can now do your investment diligence on that, but you know that the mission is protected because of who you're dealing with. Yes.
Very, very valuable. But do you identify those as that, your advice funds, or is it a layer above that? And then organizations that,
Yeah.
and then below that, then there's companies that you're funding, right?
Yep.
So it's really more layers.
Yeah. So this is a question about kind of where DAFs fit into all of that and what kind of structure this is. What's interesting is DAFs, donor advised funds, which most of you are familiar with, have replaced for a lot of family office or have complemented the idea of a private foundation. So a DAF really is again, it's a place where philanthropic investments or philanthropic grants can be made from that the family office might advise on and control not control the DAF, but control the recommendations to the DAF. And then the DAF can deploy capital. So the DAF functions in a lot of ways like the private foundation, and DAF rules have sort of a hybrid between the foundation rules that we discussed and some of the public charity rules. But DAFs are more and more engaging in impact investing. And so let's say you have money in a DAF. What Sean was talking about wouldn't be a DAF. Sean was talking about more of a fund, and what Marty and I were just talking about before was more of an investment vehicle, but the DAF can be an investor in that investment vehicle. The same way you might deploy the philanthropic capital from the foundation into a fund, you could recommend that a DAF be invested or a DAF use program funds to invest in a fund as well. So the layering is not, if we think about the family office here at the top, then we think about the pools of money, personal foundation, donor advised fund. And then we think about the investment vehicles, whether it's a direct investment in Dr. X's company, who they just started it and they sent it over a deck, or in a fund that's formed by a known charity in a space, or a sort of a known fund formation, a known fund shop that's sending out that this is our strategy around scientific research in cancer. You have all these different layers that you're going to choose from. And on the impact side, what for us is very interesting is more and more the charities are realizing that they have this amazing expertise in a way that's adjacent, in a place that's adjacent to an investing space, whether it's royalties, whether it's licensing technology or investing directly in startup companies, however it is, charities are realizing that they are in this space and that they can really be helpful as an intermediary to folks like you who are looking for opportunities, et cetera.
Last question.
And sorry, and we'll make ourselves available. If you have other questions, feel free to email us and we'll.
My question was about the scientific due diligence.
Mhm.
Because, in my experience as an endowed person myself, I found that the level of understanding I have about these mechanisms and what I might be able to help a family office do, correctly for the mission that I needed for was lacking because we don't have that
Right.
kind of background. But also, I can say anything about something I've discovered, and 10 other people may be discovering the same thing. So where does that due diligence come forward in the scientific?
So the question was, how do we think about scientific due diligence within a family office that might not have kind of the expertise, or they might be, understand the issues, but they might be emotionally involved as well. And so that's why I think it's, for us, it's been interesting getting back to this idea of if you have folks who you trust as that the organization has, let's say, a charity that is in the cancer space or the research space, college or universities as well do this. And you're asking, what processes do you have on the diligence? How are you diligencing companies? How are you thinking about the same way you might ask a fund manager, right? Like, how is that fund manager doing their diligence? I know nothing about X. This fund is doing all X stuff, and I have to trust them at a certain point, their track record, the people they're using. On the scientific side, do you have a scientific advisory board? How do you get investments run through the traps of that? All of the diligence that the charity and the fund that the charity is sponsoring doing, or the fund manager who might be in this space as well is doing. I think it's much harder to do the direct diligence on a company yourself. And we see this with our foundation clients that are investing both in funds and directly in companies, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and they are, particularly in the foundation space, you might have someone who is kind of steeped in a program area, but not necessarily in the investment kind of analysis of it. And outside advisors, I mean, groups bring in consultants and, there are kind of companies that help with the diligence. And I think that's I think you have to kind of bring the right team together to do the right analysis. And I think identifying those open areas that's a critical piece of it to make sure that you're vetting it in the way. that you
Great.
need.
And we have one very last question. It's going to take less than 30 seconds.
Because they're afraid of the distribution requirements, especially lower horizon investments, it makes economically more sense.
Yeah, so the statement was how, like, moving foundations away from being a foundation and putting the money in a DAF where they get the advisory. And a lot of people are doing that because of the ease of use and so on and so forth, though they also bump up against that DAFs sometimes have limitations on what they'll allow you to do. And some family members chafe at that a bit. So I think for a lot of people, the DAFs are a great option, and DAFs are getting more and more involved in impact investing, which is where there was a bit of a gap before. And now that DAFs are doing this, it does level the playing field. A lot of DAFs will talk about democratizing giving and philanthropy, and that's one good reason to do it. So.
Fantastic. Great job, guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.